everyone, I hope you guys are having a great day. So today we are going to pick up where we left off last time talking about cognitive dissonance. And so we will review a little bit about what cognitive dissonance is and ways to reduce it. And we'll spend most of today's lecture talking about applications for this information, how we end up running into cognitive dissonance in so many different situations in our lives, and how that changes the way that we view ourselves and how it changes the way that we view our environments. And so we're going to talk a lot about different applications of cognitive dissonance today. So if you have any questions about the material, please let me know. I know that today's material includes a lot of things that you might not have heard about in other classes, so please feel free to ask questions if you have any. One thing to note is that this week we do not have an activity. So all you'll need to do this week is to watch the lecture video, make notes, and then just let me know if you have any questions, okay? So let's go ahead and get started with lecture today. Alright, so picking up where we left off last week talking about cognitive dissonance. And so just as a review, we said that cognitive dissonance is this uncomfortable feeling that we experience when we realize that what we're believing is not lining up with what we're doing. And so we're going to be motivated to try to reduce that. And we said we can reduce that by changing the behavior, changing the belief, or keeping the original belief, keep the original behavior, and add some kind of new justification to that, okay? So talking about adding that new justification, sometimes we can do this in a way that makes it a self-affirmation, something that bolsters our self-concept and makes us feel better about ourselves, right? So we keep the original belief, we keep the original behavior, but we add in a justification that makes us feel good, right? Reducing dissonance by adding a cognition about other positive attributes. So for example, if you are someone who smokes and you have the belief, and we know that smoking is dangerous, and we need to take care of ourselves, but the behavior is that we are continuing to smoke, then we can keep both of those and add in the justification, well, I shouldn't keep smoking and I know that, but I'm really good at my job. I'm a really good mathematician or whatever it is, right? And so we say, well, I can't be perfect, right? Everybody makes mistakes. This is like saying if you are cheating on your spouse, that's the behavior that's not lining up with your belief that you're a good person, then you add the justification, well, I know I really shouldn't be doing that, but I am a really good spouse in other ways, right? I provide for them in other ways, right? And so you're doing a justification here that makes you feel better about yourself. And we tend to do this because this gives us a little bit of a boost. It makes us feel better. And if we're talking about something small, then maybe that's okay. I mean, it is true that we are human and we can't be perfect all the time, but it is important to make sure that we're not giving ourselves excuses that's covering up dangerous behavior or behavior that's hurting ourselves or someone else, right? So talking about cognitive dissonance and self-esteem being, the way that we see ourselves or our overall evaluation of ourselves, it says individuals that have high self-esteem are going to strive to keep their behavior consonant with the view of themselves. And what I mean consonant here kind of being the opposite of dissonant, meaning that the two are meshing and they're making sense together, right? In other words here, what happens is that people who have high self-esteem are going to work harder than the typical person to reduce dissonance. So they will experience dissonance in a much more negative way, right? So think about the perfectionist people, the type A people that are not good at accepting criticism, right? They don't like anything to threaten their image. They work very hard to maintain this idea of perfection, and they are very, very hard. It's very hard for them to understand that sometimes they're not going to be perfect and they don't appreciate receiving criticism from other people. And they will work really, really hard to decrease that criticism. Now, the problem here then is that people who are more on the perfectionist type A side might then end up harming themselves mentally or even physically by trying to be perfect. The type A people are the ones that have the heart attacks, right? I'm speaking to myself here, but it is important to cut ourselves some slack every once in a while. But if we have high self-esteem, that means that the beliefs that we have about ourselves are very, very high and very, very particular, and also that it's very important to us to keep those, and therefore we're going to work really, really hard to reduce cognitive dissonance. So when we're talking about reducing our cognitive dissonance, this is associated with rationalizing instead of rational thought. So rationalizing is kind of twisting something, maybe not making it logical. Rational is logical. Rationalizing means it might not be logical, but I'm going to twist it in a way to fit with my pre-existing belief or to make it a certain way, right? So when we rationalize something, it's like, okay, I'm going to find a way to make myself feel okay with this, right? So I just cheated on a test. I'm going to find a way to twist that in my mind to where it's okay. Right? Where it was just one time and I deserved it because I worked hard all semester, and so we find a way to make ourselves feel okay with this. And so, especially when it's very important for us to reduce this cognitive dissonance, we do a lot of rationalizing rather than thinking logically or rationally, right? And I think that we all do this at least a little bit all the time, right? What would life be like if we always looked at everything rationally and looked at everything logically? We might not like some of the things that we see, right? Sometimes it's okay to do a little bit of rationalizing because, as we've been saying, none of us are perfect, and we need to maintain our self-esteem so that we're not depressed. It's just important not to take this rationalizing too far, right? You might know people or have seen people who tend to take this a little bit too far and kind of rationalizing things that really should not be rationalized, right? So it's important to make sure this doesn't go too far. So when we're talking about cognitive dissonance, it is highly related to decision making. So have you ever made a decision and second guessed it, right? I think we probably would all say yes to this, right? So what kinds of decisions do you second guess? And oftentimes in an in-person class, people will say things like where they're going to go to college, or what they're going to major in, or who they're going to be in a relationship with, that kind of thing. Anytime that we make a decision, we're going to have this dissonance that we're going to talk about in a second. And it's really important for us to find a way to resolve that dissonance, to fix that situation, because as we've said, dissonance is very uncomfortable. So every time we make a decision, we experience dissonance. We experience something that doesn't line up here. So on the one hand, we have the belief that we make good decisions. We're intelligent people. We make good decisions. On the other hand, we've made a decision that will have flaws with it. Because every single decision you make has some kind of flaw to it, right? Because what you chose has some negative aspects to it, and what you rejected has some positive aspects, right? So maybe when you're thinking about where you want to go to college, there are going to be some things about the college that you chose that are not perfect, right? There'll be some negative aspects. There'll be some things you don't like about the college that you chose. And on the other hand, the colleges that you rejected have some good things, right? They have some merit to them as well. And so this is why we might second guess ourselves. We might start to wonder, did we make the right choice? This is perfectly natural. And as we'll talk about, this happens with just about every decision, right? Because no situation is perfect. There are going to be some negative things to the situation that we chose. It doesn't always have to be an important decision. Like, you can do this with food. Like, I don't know if you guys have the epic what am I going to eat for dinner tonight debate with anyone, and whether or not you eat out very often. But if you try not to eat out very often, then you try to make those times that you do eat out special, right? We want to make a good decision, pick the right place. And sometimes you get food, you pay for it, and you think, well, maybe I paid too much food, paid too much money for the food, maybe the food wasn't what I wanted, maybe I didn't enjoy it, and then you feel bad and you start to regret it and you wish you had eaten somewhere else, right? This happens with, simple decisions like where you're going to eat, but also major life decisions like who you're going to marry and what you're going to do for a living. So every situation where you have to make a decision, no decision is perfect, right? There are always going to be some negative aspects to the option you chose, and there are going to be some positive aspects to the option that you rejected. This is going to produce dissonance because we know that our decisions are not perfect. So this leads to something called post-decision dissonance. Dissonance aroused after making a decision, typically reduced by enhancing the attractiveness of the chosen alternative and devaluing the rejected alternatives. Okay, so post-decision dissonance happens pretty much after every decision, especially, as we'll see, after big decisions, but also after small decisions as well. Because, as we've said, no decision is perfect. So how are we going to reduce this dissonance? Remembering that dissonance is uncomfortable and we're going to be motivated to reduce it. We're going to reduce that by enhancing the attractiveness of the option that we chose. So we're going to think about all of the good things about the option that we chose, and we're going to devalue, or we're going to focus on the negatives for the things that we rejected. Okay? So this leads us to distort reality a little bit, kind of going back to that rationalizing thought. We can distort things a little bit, okay? So we're going to downplay the negative aspects of what we chose, as well as the positive aspects of the rejected alternative, right? So let me give you guys an example here, okay? Let's say that you committed to someone, you got engaged, or you got married, right? You made this decision. So now you want to make sure that you made the right decision, but you want to be happy with your decision that you've made. So what this is going to likely lead you to do, you're going to play up the good things about the person, your partner that you chose. You're going to downplay the negative aspects of your partner that you chose, right? Because all of us have negative aspects. None of us are perfect. We all have some little things, and maybe more than little things, that we need to work on. But if you have made this decision to be with someone, to marry someone, then you want to be happy with that decision. So you'll focus on the good things about your partner, and you'll downplay the bad things about your partner. Also, if you have married someone, then you have said, this is the person I'm going to be with, and you have rejected all other alternatives or all other people that you could marry. So then you're going to focus on the bad things about all the other people. Man, I can see that I would never be happy with them, right? You're going to focus on the bad things, and you're going to downplay the good things about the other people, right? No, they're not really that good. They're not really somebody that I would want to be with. In other words, you'll change the way that you view the world just a little bit to make yourself happier with your decision. Now, there is nothing wrong with this. This is actually good because it does increase commitment, right? You're happy in your relationship, you're more likely to be committed. And people who are committed to their relationships, as we talked about a little bit when we talked about attribution, people who are committed to their relationships and are in happy relationships are more likely to see things a certain way that will help them continue to be happy, right? There's nothing wrong with this unless we take it too far. Sometimes we can excuse behavior that we shouldn't excuse in our partner, because we don't want to feel like we made the wrong decision, right? So I'm not talking about things like abuse or infidelity, that kind of thing. I'm talking about downplaying, like not taking out the trash. I'm talking about simple things here, right? And so it's important to be realistic in this situation. But when we make a decision, we want to feel like we made the right decision. Now, the more important decisions are going to create more dissonance because we feel like it's very, very crucial that we get this right. So when we're talking about maybe where we're going to go to college, and are we going to go to grad school, and who are we going to marry, and are we going to have children, these are important decisions, and we feel like it's very important for us to get this right. Also, the more permanent the decision is, it's going to create more dissonance, because once you make the decision, you can't really go back, okay? So things like having children would definitely go in permanence. This is usually where students say, get a tattoo, right? Buy a car or buy a house, make a large purchase that you can't go back on. And then I asked the question, well, then is marriage a permanent decision? And not exactly. We can get divorced in our culture. We have that kind of panic button that we're hanging on to. And so we'll talk later in the class about whether or not that's a good thing. We'll talk about social psychology of relationships. But it's not necessarily permanent, and yet it is that it's difficult. You know, there are legal steps that take time and effort and money, and so it is semi-permanent marriage. And so for more permanent decisions or more important decisions, we will experience more dissonance, and therefore will be more motivated to reduce that dissonance. Okay? So carrying on with cognitive dissonance and decision making, talking about the decision to behave immorally. And so we said that cognitive dissonance happens when our beliefs and our behaviors don't line up. And a lot of those situations involve morality in some way. So where do we learn our morality from, or our sense of right and wrong? Well, typically we learn it from our parents, we learn it from other caregivers, from our peers, perhaps from religious beliefs that we've been taught. Wherever your morality comes from, it's supposed to guide you in making these decisions, right? So when is it okay to lie to a friend? Usually when I teach in-person class, I will have some people that say it's okay to lie if it spares their feelings, or if it's okay to lie if it benefits them in the long run. On the other hand, I always have students that say it's never okay to lie to a friend. I always want my friends to be honest with me. And so this may vary from person to person. When is it an act of stealing, and when is it borrowing, right? And so typically people will talk about, well, if it's borrowing, I know you took it, I gave permission, you're going to give it back, that kind of thing. But when we're talking about the decision to behave immorally, there is going to be a lot of cognitive dissonance here, because our behavior is going to be very influential if it doesn't line up with our belief system. That's going to create very, very serious cognitive dissonance. I mean, if these are beliefs that you hold very dearly and you see that your behavior is not lining up, that's going to create a lot of uncomfortable cognitive dissonance here. So when we have these moral dilemmas, there are implications for our self-esteem. So imagine then, if you realize that your behavior doesn't line up with your beliefs, then you start to wonder, am I really a good person? Am I really an honest person? This can change the way that you see yourself and can create a lot of uncomfortable feelings here. So then we're going to be very motivated to reduce this dissonance. And as we said, there are 3 ways that you can reduce dissonance, right? Change the behavior, change the belief, or keep the behavior, keep the belief, and add a new justifying cognition. So any of those 3 will reduce your dissonance, but the one that you choose will influence your future behavior, right? Perhaps making you more or less ethical in the future. And we're going to go through an example here to help illustrate this. So let's talk about cheating on a test, because that's relevant to you guys in college. So then we have a positive view of ourselves, that we are good, honest people, and yet that's not lining up with our dishonest behavior. This will create cognitive dissonance. Now, how are we going to reduce that dissonance? Well, one thing we can do is we can say, okay, I have a belief that cheating is wrong, and yet I'm cheating. I can change my belief and say cheating's fine. Everybody does it. It's not a big deal. Teachers don't care. Now I have changed the belief. This will reduce my dissonance because my belief and my behavior are lining up again. However, this will make my future behavior less ethical, right? I have changed my belief that cheating is wrong. Therefore, the next time I get a chance to cheat, I'm probably going to do it. So I reduce my dissonance, but I did it in a way that makes me less ethical. However, I could also, in the same situation, change the behavior. I believe that cheating is wrong. I know that I'm cheating. I'm going to change my behavior and stop cheating. Now my belief and my behavior are lining up with each other. Now in the future, I'll be more ethical because I have maintained my belief that cheating is wrong and changed the behavior. In the future, when I'm given the opportunity to cheat again, I probably won't do it. I'll be more ethical in the future. Now, in either one of these situations, we reduced our dissonance. We feel better about ourselves. However, it changes the way that we respond in the future, depending on the way that we reduce our dissonance. So you should be careful with the justifications that you allow yourself to make, right? The little lies that we tell ourselves. Now, if we decide not to cheat, and we say, I'm changing my behavior, I'm keeping the belief that cheating is wrong, I'm changing the behavior of cheating, this in and of itself is going to create dissonance. Remember we talked about post-decision dissonance? Anytime we make a decision, there are some bad things about the decision that we made. So deciding not to cheat helps me reduce my cognitive dissonance because I don't feel guilty for cheating. However, if you were in a situation where you were not prepared, you might fail a test. And then you say, well, I could have passed the test if I had cheated. So that's a negative aspect to my decision not to cheat. Okay? This is post-decision dissonance, where we start to question our decisions. In this situation, it's going to be very important for us to reduce this post-decision dissonance. We don't want to feel bad about deciding not to cheat. So what are we going to do? We're going to change that attitude that, well, I would have done better, and we will actually become even more strongly against cheating. Because I need to justify the fact that I failed a test because I chose not to cheat. The only way to do that is by telling myself that cheating is really, really bad. Otherwise, I made the wrong decision. And just so you guys know, in my book, you made the right decision by deciding not to cheat. But you really need to convince yourself that you made the right decision when you decided not to cheat. So you'll convince yourself that cheating is really, really bad. And this is how our attitudes become even more extreme. And so we're going to talk about attitudes next week. But our attitudes can be influenced by the way that we reduce our cognitive dissonance. Okay? All right, now as far as dissonance and culture, and we've talked about different kinds of cultures, the process of dissonance reduction is culturally universal. In other words, every culture that we find doesn't like cognitive dissonance. They experience cognitive dissonance and they're motivated to reduce it. However, the way that each culture reduces cognitive dissonance varies, okay? So perhaps in our culture, because we are more individualistic and focused more on ourselves, we might be more likely to justify and a little bit less likely to change our behavior. Perhaps in a more collectivistic culture that is focused on the group, they might be more likely to change their behavior because they don't want to be doing any kind of behaviors that might harm the group. Just a thought. But the way that we reduce our cognitive dissonance depends on the culture. But the fact that we don't like dissonance is pretty much culturally universal. Okay? Alright, so the idea of cognitive dissonance is also related to justifying your effort, right? In other words, anytime that we work hard for something, we need to feel like there was a reason for our hard work. Okay? Suppose that you expend a great deal of effort to get into a particular club and it turns out to be a totally worthless organization. So now you're going to experience dissonance. I worked really, really hard to get in and I didn't get anything out of it. That is uncomfortable because now we feel like, okay, I made a bad decision. I shouldn't have I wasted my time and my effort. So that's going to create this cognitive dissonance we've been talking about. So to reduce that dissonance, we have to find a way to either say, A, I didn't put that much hard work into it, or B, we'll say, well, this club's not totally worthless. There are some things that I can get out of it, right? So we're going to have to find a way to justify our effort. And so this might change the way that we feel about this particular organization. It says justification of effort, the tendency for individuals to increase their liking for something they have worked hard to attain. So imagine that perhaps you're picking grad schools that you want to go to. And so you worked hard all throughout your undergrad and you made good grades and you wrote a good personal statement and you took the GRE and you did all this effort and then you got into a particular program and you realized that, wow, I'm not sure that I like this program. That's going to cause cognitive dissonance because you're going to be like, I worked so hard for this and yet I'm not happy here. We don't like that situation. And so what we're going to do here perhaps is to try to make ourselves like the program more. I mean, I'm already here. I already made the commitment to be here. I already put in all this effort. So I must like this program. And you make yourself believe it. Those little lies we tell ourselves, right? So people may interpret ambiguities or things where I'm not sure if this is good, I'm not sure if it's bad, in a positive way when it helps to justify our effort. So maybe you're saying, well, I'm not sure I like this professor, but I worked really hard to get here, and so then all the little things that you're like, I don't know about, you'll start telling yourself that you do like that professor, you do like that situation because you worked hard to get there, and you don't want to feel like you wasted your effort, and you don't want to feel like you made a bad decision, right? So there was a research study that was trying to look at this, and they used a cover story, so they used deception, they're not telling the truth, and what they're interested in is effort justification. So what they did was they had college students volunteer to join in a group that would be meeting to discuss psychology of sex, right? So what they did, these people volunteered to be part of the group. And they said, we are going to manipulate how much effort they have to put into getting into the group, with the idea that the people who had to go through something difficult and had to work hard to get in will be happier once they get there versus the people who didn't have to work hard, right? So the independent variable, or the thing that they manipulated, was how hard the people had to work to get into the group. So they split the participants randomly into 3 groups. The first group had to go through an extremely demanding and unpleasant initiation. What they said here basically was, you are going to be in a part of a group that's talking about sex. So we need to make sure that you're comfortable talking about sex. And so they had them get up in front of the group and read very sexually explicit material that would be a little bit uncomfortable to read in front of strangers. And then the next group had a mildly unpleasant initiation where they had to read something that might have made them a little bit uncomfortable but wasn't too bad. And the third group was admitted without any kind of initiation, so they didn't have to do anything to get in. The dependent variable, the thing we're interested in measuring, is how much the individuals liked the group after they got in. So think about what we would expect here, right? We would expect the people who had to go through something very difficult would actually end up liking the group more. Why? Because they needed to justify their effort. If they didn't like the group, then they just got up and read like sexually explicit, basically pornography material in front of the entire group for no reason. And we can't believe that we did that for no reason, so we have to convince ourselves that there was a reason that we wanted to be in the group. And that is exactly what they found. People who went through a mild initiation or who were automatically let into the group didn't like the group as much, whereas the people who went through a severe initiation liked the group more. This is kind of related to hazing, right? If you're not familiar, basically hazing is something where someone is trying to join a group. Maybe it's a sports team, maybe it's a sorority or fraternity, whatever the case may be. And the people who are already part of the group come up with something for the new people trying to get in to do. And the idea is to make them do something a little bit unpleasant, and basically it makes them feel bonded to the group. It makes them feel like they have worked hard to get there, and therefore they'll like the group more. The problem is that hazing can become dangerous, right? Sometimes they take these things to an extreme. Individuals have actually died because of hazing. And so maybe it's okay in small doses, as long as all the individuals are safe and there's nothing, either physically or psychologically harmful. But it's very easy for that to slip into a dangerous area. Okay. And then the last thing that we're going to talk about today is the psychology of insufficient justification here. So we're talking about we need to justify our behavior, right? It says, if you tell a friend that you like her ugly dress very much, do you feel bad about that? Do you experience much dissonance? Every once in a while I have a student that says, yes, I would never lie to my friend about her ugly dress. But most of us say, well, I wouldn't just come out and tell my friend that her dress is ugly, okay? We don't feel bad about that, right? About telling those kinds of little lies. Why do we not feel bad about that? Well, there are many thoughts that are consonant or consistent with telling that lie, right? Well, it's important not to hurt their feelings. It's more important to maintain the friendship, right? It's not actually going to hurt the person for me not to tell them. So we have all of these external justifications that make us feel like it's okay. An external justification is a reason or an explanation for dissonant personal behavior that resides outside the individual. In other words, I believe that I'm a good person, and yet I just told a lie to my friend. I need a justification for that. And if I have an external justification, then there's something like, for example, maybe I get a reward for telling a lie, or maybe I get to avoid an uncomfortable situation by telling a lie, right? There's an external justification. And so a lot of times in this situation, I didn't tell my friend the truth because I didn't want to hurt their feelings. That's an external justification, right? And that makes us feel better. Remember, there are 3 ways to reduce dissonance. One of them is to come up with a new cognition that justifies it. An external justification is that new cognition that is not changing anything about myself. There's just something about the situation that I benefit from by telling this lie, for example. However, sometimes we have no good external justification for lying, right? Sometimes there's no punishment that we're trying to avoid and not really any kind of reward to be gained from it. So why do we lie in those situations? Well, sometimes we make an internal justification in that situation, right? The reduction of dissonance by changing something about oneself, like, for example, one's attitude or behavior. And I feel like the difference between internal and external justification can be made a little bit more clear by talking about a research study that examined the difference between external and internal justifications, right? So, in this particular study, last one we're going to talk about, we have deception here. We have a cover story. So what they did was they recruited participants and they said, we are going to have you do a really boring task. And you're probably not going to have fun. Okay? We're going to have you do a boring task. But they're going to manipulate the instructions that they give to the participants. Okay? In the one group, they're going to say, okay, we're going to have you do a really boring task, and then we're going to pay you $20 to go out into the waiting room and tell the next participant that you had a lot of fun. Okay? That's the first group. So you go out, you do the boring task, then you go out into the hallway and tell the person you had so much fun. And I'm going to give you $20 to do that. Now, would you guys do that? I mean, you're telling a lie here, but it's not hurting anybody, so we start justifying $20 to tell a lie. The second group said, okay, we're going to have you do a really boring task, and then we're going to have you go out and tell a lie and tell the next person in the waiting room that it was a lot of fun, and we're going to give you $1 to tell a lie, okay? And then finally, there was a control group where we said, we're going to have you do a really boring task, but we didn't pay them and we didn't have them tell a lie. What we're interested in here is who is going to enjoy the task more, okay? So we have this group that got paid $20 to tell the next person that the task was fun. We have this group that got paid $1 to tell the next person that this task was fun, okay? So let's see what happened. The students who were paid $20 for lying, for telling the person in the waiting room they enjoyed their task, they said the task was terrible. It was dull, it was boring, they did not enjoy themselves, okay? The $20 was a sufficient external justification for lying. They said, okay, I didn't enjoy this. I really didn't. But you gave me $20, so it's okay for me to tell that lie, right? Because it was a little lie and it didn't hurt anyone. That $20 was enough to reduce the dissonance, right? We kept our belief, we kept our behavior, but we felt like it was okay because I got paid $20 and it didn't hurt anybody, right? So they felt like it was okay. And so they said, all right, well, no, I did not enjoy the task, but I was willing to tell a lie because it was worth $20, okay? On the other hand, the students who were only paid $1 for lying were actually more likely to say they enjoyed the task. Now let's think about this. It's important to tell the truth, and yet I'm fixing to go lie to someone, okay? And I'm getting paid $1 to do it. Well, that's not a sufficient external justification. $1 is not enough money for me to reduce my self-esteem or to change my honest behavior, right? To change the way, I'm not going to change the way I see myself for $1. They feel like, okay, they were very uncomfortable with telling a lie for $1. So, to reduce this dissonance, they told themselves, well, I'm not really lying to the other person. The task wasn't boring. It was actually kind of fun. So you see what they did here. They changed their belief about the test or the task so that they wouldn't actually be telling a lie. They convinced themselves that they really did enjoy the task, and therefore they were telling the other person a lie. Or they weren't telling a lie. They were telling them the truth. Because they didn't feel like $1 was a sufficient external justification for lying. The only way to reduce their dissonance about it was to convince themselves that they really did have fun, make an internal justification here. And so they started to believe the lie they told. It was a very dull task, but they needed to feel like they weren't telling a lie, so they convinced themselves that the task was actually fun. All right, so I know that was a lot of material for today, so we do not have an activity for this week, but if you have any questions about the material, please let me know. This would be a great time to start asking questions. Otherwise, I will talk to you guys next week.